Accessibility is a right, not a privilege. Every individual, regardless of physical, cognitive, or sensory abilities, deserves access to spaces, services, information, and opportunities. Breaking Barriers for Inclusive Manitoba connects with real people to hear about their lives, challenges, and solutions to creating a more inclusive Manitoba for all.
Hello and welcome to Breaking Barriers for Inclusive Manitoba, a series for the Multicultural channel. I'm your host, Jenny Sakovac. When you think about the words inclusivity and accessibility, these words apply to probably most of the population. And it's something that we don't really think about because we can easily move around. But when you are not able to easily move around because of the environment, accessibility and inclusivity can become something to deal with. My guest today has some experience with that. His name is Colin Mathieson. He is a veteran in wheelchair athletics and a 4-time Paralympian. Please help me welcome Colin. Hey, Colin. Good morning. Thank you for coming on the show. Now, how did you get started in Paralympics?
Yeah, my start was pretty unique. I had in 1984-85, I had the luxury of meeting Rick Hansen when he went through Manitoba on his tour. And prior to that, we followed him in the newspaper. CBC did a lot of coverage, and he was just the best possible inspiration to have growing up. And when it came time to pick a sport, that was certainly one of the reasons why I picked wheelchair racing is, watching what he did. And it turned out there was a ton of other wheelchair racing athletes in Winnipeg. So I had a natural team. I had a coach.
Wow, that must have been exciting meeting him and being inspired by his story.
Yeah, it's funny. My mom and dad woke me up real early one day. We drove to Haddishmill where he had, I guess, stopped for the night. And it's quite funny to think about this now, but he was in his Winnebago, and I had probably 100 questions that I was driving my parents crazy on our way to this rest stop. And they plunked me down in front of the Winnebago, and the door opened and he pops out, and I couldn't even remember my dates.
Too funny. I had a similar experience where I met Doug Flutie, and the first thing out of my mouth was, "You were my hero." And then you just want to sink into the floor. How old were you at that time?
In six or seven.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And so I was involved in a lot of different sports, more activities than sport. With Manitoba Wheelchair Sports, there was an amazing program that they had on the weekend that all the kids with disabilities could get together. We'd play games and just sort of build those basic aptitudes for sport and recreation and physical activity.
And what was it about wheelchair athletics or racing that really appealed to you?
I love speed. Always will. But I watched the Manitoba Marathon for years and years and years, and it actually passed by our house in St. Patel, and those are my most vivid, positive memories that I have is watching these just gladiators in like mile 20, like 25, 30-degree weather, just sweating it out and grunting it out at that point. And it's just something that stuck with me. So when I got to pick a sport.
No, I can imagine. And the thing about looking at professional athletes or ones that have been doing it for a while, they make it seem so easy. So what was your first experience actually trying the racing?
Well, it was amazing just to have one of the athletes loan me a racing wheelchair. And it was a typical loaner, similar to hockey gear or whatever. It was gently used, well, we'll say. But it was just so different. It was, you take one push in that wheelchair and you went faster than you would in your regular wheelchair. So just that feeling of zippiness.
So after using the loaner, when did you get your own wheelchair?
If you stick with it or you want to stick with it, then you can sort of make a choice to invest in some more competitive equipment. And it turned out that I had an amazing sponsor early on. It was called McGowan Design Group, and they sponsored me for my very first wheelchair. And we actually went down to Florida and had it built, custom made.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
It was almost like when you listen to somebody talk about having a custom-made wedding dress or a custom-made tuxedo. Every single millimeter of that chair was exactly what I needed.
That's amazing. And now when you talk about an investment, I'm sure it wasn't cheap.
They've always been very expensive, on the cusp of being prohibitive.
Okay, so it's good to have a sponsor on board because then, trying to cover the cost yourself, I mean, you would do it, you would find a way of doing it, but it's nice to have that sponsor that can help you with that.
If anybody knows about hockey equipment for kids, you spend $150 on a pair of skates, and right after your stomach ache subsides from spending that amount of money on basically little kid hockey, they've grown out of them and they need another pair. Wheelchairs are no different, because if you at 10 years old, if you get or 13 years old, if you get a racing wheelchair.
You're going to grow, absolutely. Now, as an adult, how many wheelchairs have you gone through?
Somebody asked me this a little while ago, and I had to actually sort of go back, and I probably had in the neighborhood of 15 or 20 racing wheelchairs in my career. And as the technology improves and as the materials become more exotic, the prices have gone up. And if you wanted to buy a competitive racing wheelchair now, you're looking between $10,000 and $20,000.
Not surprising. I mean, not only technology, but also the price of, the material and everything.
Yeah, the cost of these exotic metals goes up. The rarity of them, depending on where they're even mined, that could play a part in where they're sourced from, and the cost that the end user has to pay.
I can imagine. Now, what was it like competing at your first Paralympics?
Oh, geez. I was 16 or 17 years old, and it was almost like the goldfish that got dropped into the Atlantic Ocean. I was super excited because within Canada, you had to beat X amount of athletes in order to get that spot to represent Canada. But going from the sort of the middle of the pack in Canada to being one of the better athletes in Canada that qualified, and then almost within 6 weeks getting tossed into the ocean, it's a roller coaster of emotion. And part of me thinks that I was a little naive, which saved some of my stress.
You didn't know what to expect, I guess. Yeah.
And so the first Paralympics was it was what I would consider a smaller scale Paralympics. The crowds weren't quite as crazy as my last two games. And again, just being a little naive and being full of youthful energy, it really just sort of flew by.
hmm Now, when was your last race?
My last major competition was in 2012 in London Paralympics.
Okay. Okay. And now, have you thought about racing since then, or is that a chapter that you've kind of put behind you now?
No, that's a good point, or a good question. I think an athlete will always sort of be an athlete in the back of their mind. And for me, I moved back to Winnipeg in 2012 after living in Quebec for several years. And I changed coaches, and we changed a lot of what I would consider like the meat and potatoes of what training should look like and what your expectations would be. And it turned out I got older and faster that year, which, if you ask any athlete, you can either get older or you can get faster. They don't typically collide in the same sentence. But it was just a neat training environment, new blood, new ideas.
And it's always a nice way to go out on top, so to speak. Do you miss those days sometimes?
I still, I don't compete. I haven't competed in a couple years. I sort of transitioned into what I would call a real life. But no, I'm still training. I'm still working out. I would say that based on the foundation that you build after 25 years of racing or 25 years of sport, I think there's a foundation that'll never go away. So if I needed to, I could probably dust off my racing chair and squeeze into my spandex and do a race if I needed to. I was actually thinking about doing a race just for fun with a good buddy of mine in Oregon. He was my training partner in the 90s and early 2000s. And he's just a fun guy with a lot of positive sort of memories attached to him. and he invited me out to Oregon to do a race in July.
Oh my gosh, that would be so much fun. Yeah, and especially when there's no there's no stress, there's no expectations. It's just for fun and you can really just, go all out.
So much of sport is incremental progress. Like I need to get this, this result in order to get access to this competition, or I need to get this ranking in order to get this funding. There's always a next step, which it's kind of like it turns you into a little bit of greed because you're always chasing that next thing. And you don't really ever get a chance to stop and enjoy the individual moment that you just spent, a year trying to achieve.
It's almost like a job in a sense because you're always working. And I love what you said about taking the time to really enjoy the experience. So looking back, I guess, you had to keep, chasing, as you say, chasing that dream and getting bigger and stronger and everything. But are there moments where you wish that you had taken maybe some extra time, like, when you were in Sydney, taking time to do some exploring and so on?
When you travel to especially the far ends of the world, there's always a few days that you have, whether it's on the front end or the back end of a competition. Like for example, in Australia, we were there for like a month and a half between the pre camp and then the final closing ceremonies, and then a few days before you get on the plane to go on. And there's always a moment where you can go out for a coffee, go out and sort of tour around the city, and you have to be sort of conscious of, if it's going to be before the competition, you can't be spending, hours and hours outside in the heat, because then you'll be exhausted and heat stroke by the time the races even start. But on the back end, it's kind of fun because, you just have this moment of release where you no longer are sort of on the clock and you just try and find something fun. And it also depends on how your racing went. I've had competitions where I've had 4 days after a horrible competition, and all I want to do is sit in the hotel room and sleep and try and forget all the things that didn't go well that week. And in comparison, you have a really good experience and you have an opportunity to go up for, dinner with a friend.
Well, absolutely. It's, better to celebrate than to, kind of, you know, down in the dumps, so to speak. Yeah. Now, when we talk about accessibility, and, it's interesting because when you are competing as a Paralympian, you would think that there were things in place to make sure that there is that accessibility and makes it easier for you to be in that environment. Did you find that it was the case or maybe not?
The Paralympics themselves are kind of a unique scenario, no different than the Olympics, in the sense that they are in a location, but they are so insulated from the rest of a city, a country, or a part of the world that you're not really, when you're in the athlete village is designed by the Olympic Paralympic committees. The venues are designed by the Olympic and Paralympic committees. And so unless you sort of wander outside of the fence, you wouldn't necessarily see anything related to a particular country, a particular city, or culture, or anything like that, which is one of the reasons why I like to do a little bit of a wander, whether it's going out for, half an hour, 45-minute wheel, just try and find downtown at somewhere and try and find, a harbor, just anything that's different than the confines of the village and the stadium.
Do you find that things are better or more improved when it comes to accessibility? Or would you say that they're probably about the same? Because you think about technology, you think about, advancements and so on. So would you say that things have improved or maybe not so much?
There are a lot of countries that I had the luxury to go to that are, 5, 6, 800 years old. And some of them have been so well preserved, which is absolutely amazing considering how old these cities are. But unfortunately, 800 years ago, they weren't made accessible.
No.
So there's steps and cobblestone and really tall, skinny buildings that don't have elevators. There's a million different attributes that are absolutely gorgeous to read in a magazine, but don't really play out as far as function for myself. But there's other countries that, whether it be tourism or natural disasters, as crazy as it sounds, If you live in an area that has natural disasters, unfortunately, you might be rebuilding your city more often than the ones that have been around for 700 years. And you can always build it better the next time. And the other big consideration is tourism. There's the capitalist model of we want everybody's money. It helps make things accessible because they don't want to have a reason to not take my money, based on being in a wheelchair. So all of a sudden you've got this equalizer that in order to make more money, they have to attract more guests or more spectators, more tourism. And with the aging population that has a ton of bad wealth, even the baby boomers are now dictating what the world looks like.
And that's an interesting way of looking at it because you're right. The baby boomers are dictating because they have the wealth, but also because as you age, I mean, your mobility is decreasing in some cases.
Car accidents and stuff like that results in you having a disability. But there's also this natural progression of just sort of deteriorating or falling apart as you get older. And it only really goes in one direction. So we've got a huge population that's, disabled. And then we've also got a huge population that's going to be disabled. And you don't really get out of that. You don't get a free pass.
No, unfortunately not. I mean, that's just nature. That's just physics, and
You can hold off and with either luck or good health or commitment to health, you can delay some of those aging realities. But everybody, and I said this in an interview quite a few years ago. I said that everybody's temporarily able-bodied.
hmm that's interesting when you think about being able-bodied and being able to move around. In my intro, when I talked about, accessibility and inclusivity, most of us don't even think twice about it. But you're right. I mean, as you get older and not necessarily having to use a walker or a wheelchair or even a cane, but just moving slower. Before our interview, we were kind of chatting and you had mentioned that it's the environment, not the person. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
There are so many different levels of ability. You can't put it on the individual. And so the environment in this day and age, there's no, other than those historical buildings that I talked about as far as, the 800-year-old cities, like the environment really does shape the individual, not the other way around. And in a perfect world, the society will shape design moving forward. But up until then, unfortunately, the built environment is a bit of a barrier for a lot of different groups.
hmm And even in Winnipeg, I mean, I know that we've done a lot to improve that, but there's still some room for improvement, though, isn't there?
Certainly old enough that we have buildings that were built prior to any accessible design, and some of them have been retrofitted, some of them have not, and the even the 6 months of winter that we have really does change what Winnipeg looks like from the accessibility.
In particular, in terms of snow clearing, I know that that's come up as an issue, sidewalks not being cleared right away. And when you're in a wheelchair, it can be difficult to move around.
Absolutely, and I'm fortunate that I have a vehicle and I drive, but I look at the number of kilometers I put on the car between October and April, or November and April, in comparison to April and September. I'm driving more, and it's the sidewalks aren't clear. There's the temperature is too great.
I can imagine. Now, in terms of breaking barriers, what would your thoughts be on what the city can do going forward in terms of helping those who are not so able-bodied?
Well, I think that the city has gone to great lengths. They've had some amazing universal design consultants that they've had on staff, not just consulted with, but on staff, which I think is a big difference. Because if you're not sitting at the table when they're designing the city, then you can't possibly have an impact after it's been built and they're trying to fix it or trying to circumvent something that's already been decided that now they have to repair it. So having the right people at the table on day one for any of the big projects, any of the big designs, being part of a master plan rather than an afterthought. I think that's a huge benefit that we've seen with the city of Winnipeg since they've hired these universal design consultants, and polling the audience, having a finger on the pulse as far as what the community wants, what the community needs. I think those are all very important sort of components for a more desirable final product.
And I'm glad that the city is going in that direction, although I'm sure there's room for improvement there as well.
There's always room for improvement, and there's also differences between what the public can influence, like the city of Winnipeg and the province, versus what the private entities are still allowed to do. It's within building code.
Now, one final thing. What could you say to someone out there who, as a 6-year-old, when you first met Rick Hansen and he inspired you to get involved in wheelchair racing, what's one tip or one encouraging word that you could share to somebody who may be thinking, well, I'm in a wheelchair, what can I do?
Wow, that's a good question. I think it whether you're able-bodied or have a disability or any sort of age group, you got to find what you love. And for somebody, it could be, doing something in school. It could be doing something on the track. It could be doing something on the basketball court. It could be just doing something in your community. And, once you find that thing, it's so much easier to go all in.
And don't let anything stop you, not even the fact that you're not, air quotes, able-bodied.
There's an uphill waiting for you no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to figure out how to get up to the top.
Oh,
It's that easy.
I love that. Thank you so much, Colin, for being here and sharing your experience as a Paralympian and just your experience with life and how you've been able to embrace life and really enjoy everything. So this has been Breaking Barriers for Inclusive Manitoba for the You Multicultural channel. I'm your host, Jenny Sakoback.
Breaking Barriers for Inclusive Manitoba is focused on raising awareness and taking action to prevent and remove accessibility barriers. This initiative is proudly in partnership with Accessibility Manitoba, working together for a more inclusive future.